So if you've taken a look at Raider IO over the last couple of seasons, you might have noticed a trend forming where the top, I don't know, let's say 10 plus teams have been all from the Chinese realm. And that might have led you to the question, why are the Chinese teams super dominant in Mythic Plus? And today we're going to take some time to kind of talk about why they are just so damn good at World of Warcraft Mythic Plus. Even if you just take a cursory glance at what's going on at the front page of the leaderboard, most of the runs will be from teams from the Chinese region running, varieties of comps, but tending to run the most meta-specific compositions to try to be able to push as high as possible. And if you take a look at tanks, which I think is a good conduit to trying to determine how many of the top groups there are actually 16 out of the top 20 tanks are from the Chinese region, meaning there are 16 teams for every 4 Western teams here. And then this is also true if you go over to their version of twitch.tv, douyu.com, and you can basically click on most of these top end players who are playing at any given point and watch them do high keys or potentially even world first keys basically in real time, where some people will be attempting things such as 19 Operation Floodgate. This was a 20 Theater of Pain that was being attempted a few minutes ago. I wonder what ended up happening here. I think this will probably end up being like a 19 Priority to the Sacred Flame, but that's kind of what you should be looking to expect whenever you're watching these teams. And there's just a large variety of them that are doing the absolute maximum level of keys. And so that kind of calls into question, why are they so much better than the Western counterparts and kind of what's actually going on with there? A very common misconception is that they play with a different loot system or have a different version of the game. I just kind of want to get out in front of this. This is just completely false. They played the exact same version of the game as the rest of the world. They have the exact same loot rules. There's nothing weird with their vault. It's all the exact same. Maybe it was a situation where it was like that before I started playing in Warlords of Draenor, but since Legion, as long as I've been really paying attention to the scene, they have had the same loot rules as the rest of the world. So with that written off, the answer is actually kind of simple. They actually just take it a little bit more serious than the rest of the world. And the amount of players that they have that play at the top end of their player base, right, who take the game very seriously, they have more of them, as we've seen in the past, where we saw players getting DQ'd for title. We saw that was like 6,000-ish players, meaning that their player population for those people who do Mythic Plus is very, very large. So we know that they have more players than the rest of the world combined. And on top of that, of those players that they have, more of them take it a lot more serious. And I think this is heavily reflected in their results. And whenever I say they take it more serious, it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So how it works for most people who play World of Warcraft is, especially at a very high level, is you balance both Raid and Mythic Plus, right? Where you balance Raid progression and you balance, just kind of doing Mythic Plus as like a casual side activity whenever you're no longer in the Raid or whenever Prog is over or something like that. For these players, or like in a lot of them as well, a lot of the top end Mythic Plusers, they'll also be competing in things like the Race to World First and whatnot. However, these players, a lot of them are full-time Mythic Plus players. In China, there is a pretty steep divide between players who are Raiders and players who are doing Mythic Plus, where the top end Mythic Plusers, that's all they do all day, every day. And they don't really raid, or at least they don't do progression rating. We're going to get to the rating situation in a little bit, but they don't do progression rating at all, which means that they allocate all of their time to learning how to do the highest level of keys and just attempting things. On top of that as well, and if you've played any of the PTR cycles, you may have noticed this. They spend a ton of time in PTR cycles just trying new things, attempting new strats, and trying to learn how to just figure out a bunch of tech in a bunch of different ways inside the dungeons. And on top of that as well, especially with the Resilient Keystone system, that now affords them more opportunities to take more risks inside of dungeons. That's why whenever you see a lot of the top end groups from the West, they'll start looking at some of these Chinese routes or Chinese strategies for their baseline in the dungeons and figure out how to copy those routes or those strategies. I think that whenever we start to watch the MDI in a couple of days, something that you're going to see that's super common is a lot of teams going Big Mama first in Operation Floodgate, for example. You know where that started? This team that you see on screen right here. These were the first people that started doing this weird mind soothe to where you're going to Big Mama first, and everybody knows how much faster they were than the rest of the world. And so I suspect that route's going to be largely copied just because of how fast it is. Okay, so obviously they spend a ton of time practicing the game. Obviously they spend a ton of time attempting stuff and innovating the strats that all the rest of the world ends up copying. Those are probably the biggest reasons that they are so dominant in Mythic Plus. Just the fact that they are so willing to play 10 hours a day, every day. in the past as well, they would play on good weeks, on bad weeks. It didn't matter for them whether or not the affixes that week were good or bad. They would end up playing every single week as well. And I think that also ended up giving them a huge leg up just in general whenever you were looking at it in past expansions like Shadowlands or Dragonflight or whatever. But on top of that, they're also really willing to hyper optimize their compositions with things that they think might just be marginally better. Whenever you look at all of those tanks that we saw earlier, 15 of them were playing Vengeance Demon Hunter, and I suspect that 15 of them were playing with an Unholy DK, a Moonkin, and a Mage. It's one of those things that they aren't really willing to play bad compositions because they take the game so seriously. Fodder rerolling is just heavily expected, and if you're not going to fodder reroll inside of their group, they are going to lob you, and they are going to get somebody else who will. So I mentioned they don't raid, and that's kind of an interesting proposition because how would they not fall behind in terms of gearing if they don't raid? It's one of those things that you have to have the best available gear at any point, especially if you're trying to achieve something as prestigious as purely being the rank 1 group in the world. You're probably going to need the most available gear possible that you can ever have. So how are they supposed to be able to compete if they don't raid? And so whenever I say they don't raid, I meant they don't raid progression. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon there where buying a boost is actually very common, and basically at the point of which their version of Race World First guilds like JTH or Hot Pot Hero or Skyline in the past or Astra in the past or whoever, whenever they would finish their World First progression, they would immediately on the next re-clear start selling to buyers and giving them full loot funnel priority, which that's fairly rare. So I mean, it's like the equivalent of like if Liquid or Echo immediately had a buyer their next sale and gave them a full loot prio on every single piece they wanted. Which everything I'm going to say here is currently possible within the current game system just by using gold to be able to purchase boosts. So nothing that's actually going to be happening in this next section is something that couldn't happen in the West. It's just kind of a difference in the culture that we're kind of talking about here. And so a lot of these groups will actually end up having a huge gear advantage, at least at the very start of the season, over their Western counterparts. Obviously, this ends up normalizing as the season goes on, as players get better gear, especially with things like dinars that have been recently announced as well. That's going to kind of even the playing field a little bit as well, where everybody who really wants to can kind of have very similar-ish gear, or at least as close to TR as possible. And so especially very early on in the season, whenever you see China being super dominant like you're seeing right now, I mean, they have a pretty distinct gear advantage, and it's fairly common for people to be willing to throw down money to be able to buy a boost. And if you use that statement right there to say, oh, they're cheating, you're just missing the point. There's also like a time commitment phenomenon where you see some of these top teams from the West, and what they'll end up doing is they'll be very competitive. And what do they do whenever they're super competitive? They compete in things like the Race World First, like the MDI, like the TGP. For the Chinese region, they don't view their time as valuable enough to actually want to compete in things like the MDI or the TGP. And we're going to talk about this in just a second as to why their time isn't valuable enough. But it largely kind of boils down to the fact that they would end up having to spend 10 plus hours on the tournament realm whenever they could be realistically doing anything else. And their results aren't necessarily guaranteed, right? They kind of view it as like, why would I spend 10 hours on the TR just to get third, just to get fourth? And realistically, we've actually seen Aster Y almost win an MDI. They came in second place in one of the MDIs, and they won a TGP. And so obviously it's a situation where the region itself is capable of putting up absolute world-class talent to the point where they could win an MDI or a TGP, but it's more about the time commitment. As a region, it has been proven time and time again that they would rather just push on live as opposed to concerning themselves with the amount of time that's put on the TR. But in the West, committing yourself to a very long MDI season, a very long TGP season, and raiding in the Race World First is pretty common. If you think about professional players in World of Warcraft, a lot of the times they are competing in the MDI or the TGP, and they're raiding Race World First simultaneously. It's kind of a combination of all these things, where we kind of will watch a season of the MDI, and most of the competitors in some capacity will actually be on the Echo raid roster, which is kind of funny. But the Chinese teams historically have also done better in the TGP than they have in the MDI, and that's basically because since 8.3, historically, that's kind of what they've been doing, is just been heavily pushing keys on live, and it's basically exactly what you end up doing on retail, which is why they end up being better at that tournament realm TGP-esque format. But I think it's pretty undeniable as well that a lot of the Western teams end up spending a lot of time just doing MDI or TGP practice and not pushing these heavy accolades on live. Where it's kind of a question of like if Kira's team and if Skylark's team and if Nerf came out of retirement and if the Echo team came out of retirement on live and they were starting to push as hard as possible to become rank 1, could they achieve that? The answer is it's maybe, right? Like it would definitely be close and it will be a lot more competitive. But as it currently stands, those teams are very tournament realm focused, and they're focused on trying to win competitive competitions for a large price pool, and they're less concerned about pushing live keys. All right, so this is about to get a little bit weird, but you're just going to have to stick with me for a second. So the finances of this situation are kind of interesting as well. It's kind of widely known that a lot of the Chinese teams are RMTing or buying boosts with real money. I don't think this is any different than if you were just buying a boost with gold realistically, but what you need to know about the region is it's very drastically different than the West in the sense of everything is kind of financially motivated there, where you get more boosts if you're at the top of the Raider.io leaderboard. That's a huge incentive for you just as a team to be able to push as hard as possible because you know you're getting more boosts and you're being able to get better cuts, especially for these Mythic Plus runs whenever you're at the top of the leaderboard. So getting top Rio ranks is financially motivated for all these Chinese teams because they're able to carry more clients for real money. And I had to reach out to some people who play high-end in the Chinese scene just to make sure that I had my facts correct here. But they stated that money is the main factor that makes the Chinese teams seemingly dominate the Mythic Plus leaderboard, and honestly why Chinese teams don't have the motivation to compete with Echo and Liquid in the Race to World first. Another statement is for Western players, if you want to push your limit or be big to grow as a WoW streamer, what do? You join Echo or Liquid to compete for the Race to World first, right? But in China, you don't have to. But otherwise, being a professional player is very hard. And that's kind of why another reason why the Chinese teams seem to dominate the live leaderboard, but don't dominate the MDI, which is, again, that time allocation that I was kind of talking about earlier. In order to be fully prepared for the MDI, you're going to need to practice off stream, which will greatly affect their income. Because for them, pushing live keys gets them more clients, but pushing off stream and not on the live leaderboard where results are posted, it's going to be worse for their income. And this will end up meaning no streams or lack of streams. And then they also can't boost their clients, which again was their main source of income before. And then if they end up failing in the MDI or the TGP, they get absolutely clowned on by the community as well. And they damage their reputation. So it's one of these things too that they could compete on TGP or MDI, but then they run the risk of people looking at them differently if they don't perform as well as the community believes that they should. So MDI for them is, in other words, a terrible decision with a terrible cost to performance ratio. And apparently the CN community can also be very results oriented and pretty toxic at times, where if you win, your praise is a god, but if you lose, you're going to get absolutely clowned on for years to come. And so then you don't end up wanting to play anymore. Which I learned about this recently, and apparently one of the reasons that Aster Y competed in the MDI or the TGP, because you would kind of wonder, like, oh, okay, why did they even go as hard as they did? It's basically because their rogue, Yulo, and he was their main shot caller for reference, he basically wanted to win a world championship so he could shut up his haters and ended up proving them wrong. He ended up winning, which, so he ended up doing that. But at the same point, the team was also sponsored by a major organization with Aster Y, so they, had the money in the capital. They weren't motivated at that time to be pushing live keys as opposed to, basically giving up their job and practicing on the TR, so they didn't really have to worry about it because they were sponsored. They were also a team that was playing together for quite a long time. A lot of these teams will end up blowing up in between seasons, or they kind of move pieces around. And to be able to win an MDI or a TGP, you kind of have to have a team that's been playing together for a significant period of time. And then also their composition was just excellent. ZyBB is a very great Shadow Priest. Yulo is an incredible rogue. And so I think that season, their composition also just kind of hit. So I have a couple of interesting things on screen here. These are what I would describe as boosting sheets, right? These are price sheets where it describes in Chinese yuan the prices of all of the runs and the classes that you can end up buying them on and what the price is going to end up being for those. And for these runs, a lot of them are relatively cheap. You'll end up seeing things for like 210 RMB, which I think is like $20 US or something like that. So you don't really just look at this in terms of like actual value. You kind of look at this in terms of like purchasing power. Like 6,000 to 7,000 yuan on average per month is like a decent job. So I would equate it to like 1-to-1. Just so like basically in theory, you see the prices here. You see that a boost is 210 yuan, which is like this is like a full mythic clear right here. That you just kind of equate that to $210. So it sounds like most of the boosters are getting 6,000 to 7,000 yuan a month, and where some of the top end is getting like 25,000 yuan a month ish. And so whenever you kind of talk about them buying boosts, it's actually super prevalent to where you, especially if you're these top end groups, you're very heavily incentivized to be buying the first reclear that's right after the race to world first is over. And that way you have a massive item level advantage over the rest of the world, because then you can continue to translate that into more sales for you where you're selling more Mythic Plus runs. And so everything is financially motivated in the region, just in general. And according to the sheet as well, you can buy the Galliwix mount for 80 yuan. So the equivalent of $80. And so it makes sense that, especially with RMT being so commonplace in this region, and honestly, you know, being the main driving source of why they play the game, right? They're playing it because they're financially motivated to play it. It's basically their job. Viewing it as their job, I think, kind of puts it in a different lens. They're not actually playing the game for fun like all of these other teams. They are playing it because they are financially motivated and it is their full-time job. And by continuing to get rank 1 runs, that continues to get them more and more clients. Whenever you see screenshots like this floating around on Twitter where Thune says, oh yes, I also do 17 splits in a singular day, I wonder how much they made. It's kind of interesting, but also it makes sense whenever you consider that basically boosting in World of Warcraft is their full-time job.
So there's a little bit of bug with faction transferring, I heard, and avoiding the Mythic loot lockout.
I haven't confirmed this to be true, but what I was told is, what you can see on screen right here, is you do a Mythic raid and then you transfer your character. You're supposed to be locked to the old lockout. So you're not supposed to be able to like re-enter the instance or get like a new loot lockout at all. However, if you're the first person to go into the raid in a group that has not cleared the raid at all, you avoid the loot lockout just as a whole. And so you can do that multiple times. Same with the second, same with the third run. And then you could be able to get a ton of gear on a per week basis. And that's how you're actually seeing some of these top end tanks purchasing multiple runs in a per week basis and supercharging their loot basically faster than any other group possibly could. So you could realistically have 3 Mythic loot runs in 1 week if you really want to, if you wanted to shell out the money for it. And it's not like this doesn't happen in the West. There's rumors going around about how much gold JPC is spent on boosts, but realistically, JPC is not raiding right now. So how does he have all this Mythic loot? He's buying boosts. So it's not like it's something that doesn't happen in the West. It's just far less common is kind of the point that I want to make here. So yeah, it's a complicated process, but realistically, it kind of comes down to the fact that they just take the game really, really seriously at the high end, and they value pushing live keys more than the rest of the world, realistically, whether it be due to financial incentives, whether it be due to the fact that it is their job, whether it be due to the fact that they just want to get rank 1. They heavily value pushing every single day, every single season, as hard as humanly possible to be able to get rank 1, where other groups maybe take a break every couple of seasons, or they're stuck on the TR trying to compete for tournament realm prizes and MDIs and winning TGPs and stuff like that. And honestly as well, there's just a higher population of players that take the game a lot more seriously in China, to the point where you see stuff like this happen every single season, where at least half of the top 10 groups are from the CN region. And I think culturally, just how they end up participating with Mythic Plus is just a lot different than how the rest of the world participates with Mythic Plus, where you end up seeing these teams just absolutely dominating. It's kind of cool whenever you can't see the world really looking to keep up, and they kind of continue to copy the Chinese strategies on all the dungeons to try to figure out what the absolute best strat is in each and every single situation. Like, I mean, you see right here, Anuo is going for world first 20 Theater of Pain while we're even in the middle of this video, which is kind of funny to even consider, because, you know, then all these other teams that are practicing on the TR are going to then rip off what Anuo has kind of paved the way with timing this run on a 20, and try to figure out whether or not they can learn anything from what he's doing. And I think it's kind of cool as well that they just have full-time Mythic Plusers, and they don't have to concern themselves with weeks of progression rating and doing reclears whenever they don't want to. They just kind of log in. They'll be like, yep, I'm going to buy boost. I'm not really too worried about the rest of it. And then they just kind of figure it out and just play as much or as little as they want to on a per season basis. But overall, that's why China is dominating the Mythic Plus leaderboard. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, kind of talking about a bunch of different stuff. It goes a bunch of different ways, because it's such a complicated topic, because they don't play the game in a similar fashion to the rest of the world. They basically have different priorities. And as a result, 16 of the top 20 runs are from the Chinese region. So I think the results are pretty undeniable in that regard. If you enjoyed this kind of video, come check out my Twitch stream and continue to like and subscribe for more future content.